This week on the agenda, a rebalancing of relations. Has President Trump upended the US-Europe alliance? And what are the potential repercussions for the global order? For decades, the relationship between the United States and Europe was characterised as a transatlantic alliance with shared values that gelled on foreign policy and security. Yet after a week of diplomatic shocks, including the Trump administration excluding Kyiv and Brussels from talks to end the crisis in Ukraine, do the US and Europe still speak the same language? And what will it all mean for the international system as we know it? Joining me now are Erol, Morkoc, spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK, Denis Macshane, the former Minister for Europe for the UK, and Waya, Quiviger, a professor at the IE School of Politics, Economics and Global Affairs in Spain. Waya, let's start with you. Since Donald Trump took office, things have really moved at pace, and then came that phone call between Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Why did that send shockwaves through the EU and through NATO?
This phone call was largely unexpected. For the past 3 years, the EU and the US and NATO have stood firm when it comes to their position on Russia, their position on Ukraine. They've together applied many sanctions on Russia since the invasion in 2022. And for the most part, there was absolutely no communication between Russia and the United States. And this phone call out of the blue from Trump to Putin, without informing his European allies, without informing Ukraine or Zelensky, felt like a total betrayal. And also America going rogue and deciding that they were going to take steps unilaterally without consulting their allies. So this is a complete break from what has been, the unanimous or common position over the past 3 years.
Denis, what do you think? I mean, didn't we expect Trump's second administration to test the US-Europe relationship?
Everybody knows that Donald Trump wakes up in the morning and decides, what the heck am I going to do to shock things? He's a disruptor. We know that. I'm less convinced about the permanent love-in between America and Europe over since the Second World War, when Britain and France, for example, invaded Egypt at the Suez Crisis. President Eisenhower phoned up Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, who was his comrade in arms in the desert in the war, and said, Harold, have you gone mad? And Eisenhower cut all funding to Britain until they withdrew their troops. So America, it's got its own positions. It's confusing simply because Europe has not actually done as much as America. We've not sent enough arms. Both America and Europe have sent enough arms to Ukraine to keep the battle going, but not enough decisively to win. And that is the fault of both parties. Now, we'll see where Mr. Trump's going to go. Frankly, I won't want to wait. I want to wait for next week, the week after next, the week after next. Yesterday, Monday, President Macron convened a meeting of European leaders in Paris, but he only invited 9 of them. Where were the other 18? And so people in Europe are also playing their individual games. So that's just my personal take on it. But yeah, a shock, yes, combined with this childish outburst from the vice president, some chap called J.D. Vance. I don't know what his first name is. I always suspicious of people who run with initials. And it was just pathetic.
And Eric, I want to bring you in there because Denis was talking, of course, about J.D. Vance's comments at the Munich Security Conference. He really shocked delegates by attacking allies like the EU and Britain, accusing European governments of retreating from their values and criticising the state of their economies. The speech didn't go down well, did it? Is it a signal of a US policy shift, do you think?
I do think it's a signal of a U.S. policy shift. And while it may not have gone down well in the international intelligentsia arenas, it certainly played well at home. When you look at J.D. Vance's perspective, he simply is saying that the Europe Europe and the Americans do not seem to share some of the same fundamental values we thought we did, at least at a base level. When that comes to free speech, you saw J.D. Vance frequently bring up concerns about lack of free speech in the UK or in Germany. When it comes to free elections in Romania, he brought up concerns about how the fact that that election was abrogated due to implied Russian involvement. But I think J.D. Vance came there as a friend. I mean, this is the Munich Security Conference. The United States effectively is a security umbrella of Europe. And the United States is who has been fighting this war financially more than the Europeans have. So when he comes there, he's not coming to scold, perhaps, but Americans feel very confused when we see people on the news. For example, these German politicians came on 60 Minutes the other day talking about arresting people for offensive tweets and this and that. That's very un-American. That's against our unalienable rights. And many Americans did not realize that the typical American was so divergent from the typical European. And I think that's where J.D. Vance's speech played very well at home. It doesn't represent a massive shift for somebody to come in and air their grievances. In fact, that's what happens in diplomacy and in a democratic society. And certainly J.D. Vance ruffled some feathers, but he didn't come there as an enemy of Europe. He came there as perhaps a confused American MAGA patriot who doesn't see the values being shared that he hoped would be shared. And I think that's our takeaway from it.
I can see everybody else raising their eyebrows there. I mean, Denis, you're shaking your head, you're smiling.
Well, it's very sweet of Erol. By the way, the European Union collectively has given more money to Kyiv, to Ukraine, but not on the military front. On the military front, the Americans have been in the lead, but not on the general economic and financial support mechanism. So I think we have to start by just getting all of our facts in a line. Yeah, I mean, I was just baffled. I mean, come on, J.D. Vance is not some sort of hillbilly lad from the flyover Midwest. He went to Yale University.
He's the vice president.
One of the smallest universities in the world. He's the vice president. He's very articulate. He wrote a brilliant book about his youth. He knows fine well in Germany to encourage racism is to go straight back into, to talk about the lying press. That was a Hitler phrase. Sorry, Erol, you're shaking your head.
It's not Hitler, man. Come on.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. J.D. Vance himself, when he talks about the fact that Germans are nervous about racism as they were over anti-Semitism and are not going to allow, and we don't want it in Britain either. And actually, on the whole, in America, you don't want it. You fought a big fight for civil rights to let non-white Americans feel free. We're having that fight a bit later in the day, possibly in Europe. Our non-white Europeans should feel fully European if they're born here. I'm proud to defend that, and I will not take lessons from anybody who says that attacking racism, anti-Semitism, anti-women policies is somehow a threat to democracy and freedom.
Waya, I want to bring you back into the conversation here and pick up on some of those threads, with Vance saying that the greatest danger to Europe was not geopolitical rivals, but the danger from within. And that's what we're talking about here. What do you take from that?
Absolutely. I think J.D. Vance's speech came as a complete shock for the European delegates at the Munich Security Conference. He came really to chastise them and lecture them about how to run their own countries, which I think many delegates and Europeans at large felt was unacceptable. It was completely out of place and uncalled for, and really not the main reason for convening at the Munich Security Conference. I think the real issue was Ukraine, and he barely discussed it. And I think a lot of the European delegates were shocked beyond belief. Now, going back to this, and I guess the Munich Security Conference just amplified and crystallized what has been going on since Trump came into office. What we're seeing is this completely new approach to both trade, and I guess maybe we're going to be touching upon trade in a second, and security. And the fact that we're not talking about an alliance. We're not talking about the allies, the US and its European allies any longer. We're talking about America deciding to take bilateral action to end the war in Ukraine and inviting to speak with Putin, sidelining Ukraine, sidelining Zelensky, and sidelining the European allies. And I think this is what we really need to take away from the Munich Security Conference, from J.D. Vance's speech, from Marco Rubio's speech, from Hexet's speech. Yeah. They're all, even though we see a lot of contradictions within what they're actually saying, the common thread is that we're no longer talking about a united international community, united against Russia. We're talking about America talking directly to Russia and sidelining its historical allies, and of course, sidelining Ukraine.
So let's talk about what happened next. Erol, European leaders then met for emergency talks on Ukraine, having, as Waya was talking about, they felt they were being sidelined from ceasefire negotiations between the US and Russia, which then happened later on in Saudi Arabia. How can Europe secure a meaningful role in shaping a peace deal process?
Well, it's a very difficult question because ultimately this has been viewed by Donald Trump as a proxy war between the Americans and the Russians. And the infighting between European nations, for example, some nations were not invited to this. This was obviously a power play by Emmanuel Macron to take his mantle as the leader of Europe, and he thinks he can do that successfully here. But you have pushback internally, whether it be from the Germans or others who do not want to send troops or any sort of peacekeeping force in certain respects. So when you look at it from that aspect, Europe needs to come to a cohesive decision at what their policy is, how much they're willing to commit militarily. Yes, humanitarian aid is great, but military aid is why this war has not been lost. And so that's where Europe needs to find consensus and bring that consensus to Washington. Because right now, Washington is looking at Europe as a bunch of fractured states, and it's looking at Russia as a singular bilateral deal that it can make with them. And Ukraine, honestly, a lot of Americans aren't exactly happy with how Ukraine has conducted this war. We're not exactly happy that it's gone on for so long. We feel like there was a peace deal that was possible sooner. Over 1 million people, roughly, on both sides all around have lost their lives. Incalculable economic and environmental damage has been done by this war. And if Europe wants to be part of the discussion, they need to have a cohesive and unified front, because right now they're fractured and we don't see them as a reliable ally in ending this war quickly. And that's what we need to do. We need to quickly end this war and bring about rebuilding. And perhaps that's where Europe could step up in the rebuilding process, something that's more appropriate for their level of financial ability.
Denis, what do you think here? Because we're focusing very much on Ukraine because of the Munich Security Conference and the events that have happened over the last week. But the transatlantic rifts are nothing new, are they? I mean, we can talk about trade, we can talk about tariffs, we can talk about semiconductor chips.
Sure, and I think I don't like using the word Europe. There are 27 sovereign states, some with very, very different positions. When the war started, President Macron went over also on his knees to Putin, or rather not on his knees. He sat at a sort of 30-foot-long table exchanging platitudes, and Putin just laughed at him, just as he's laughed at everybody from America. I mean, right now, Putin is playing Trump. I mean, it must be happy days are here again. Open the vodka, boys, in the Kremlin. We've got Trump dancing to our tune. But on the other side of the equation, I completely agree with Erol. The European nations, there's no such thing as Europe. There's not a single European government. There's no European army, no European defense industry. We produce 12 different types of tanks. I don't know how many different types of guns. We've absolutely refused the common sense policy of having a good, tough European, collective European defense policy.
Do you think that this is all noise coming out of the United States, or that maybe this rift is much more than semiconductor chips and trade wars?
Well, to echo what Denis has been saying, it's very hard to keep track of Trump's mood and the decision of the day. So it's very hard to say if this rift is eternal. What we do see is a rift. It's a rift today, and I think what we need to do is deal with what we have on the agenda today. So what we have on the agenda today is a rift when it comes to Ukraine, this new bilateral approach with Putin, the recent pariah, now chief negotiator, because to be quite honest, we haven't seen any concessions coming from Russia. All we've seen is that America has decided to, reboot diplomatic relations with Russia, which had been frozen for 3 years, even start to talk about potential investment opportunities, and then decide that, agree basically that Ukraine is not going to ever join NATO, and it's sort of a de facto understanding that the territories in eastern Ukraine will remain Russian. So I don't see any concessions for this supposed ceasefire, should it happen, brokered between America and Russia. I don't see any Russian concessions. They're just going to win. Now, in terms of trade, the rift is very much there as well. But again, it's there today. These are threats. So what we've seen is that America has threatened, and again, I'm going to just stick to the EU because obviously it threatened a lot of former allies, 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum starting in March. And this reciprocal trade, these reciprocal tariffs that are absolutely ludicrous, and I'm sorry for these words, but I mean, this is a complete infringement, violation of multilateral trade rules. You can't just decide to change, to do tit for tat tactics on goods because you want to, and not just matching tariffs, but matching VAT taxes and subsidies out of the blue. So now, whether or not this will happen, it's supposed to, Trump has asked for this investigation with the results due on April 1st. So we'll see. Again, anything can happen between now and April 1st. So is this, are we on the trade war path? Yes, I just recently wrote an article on this. We are on the war path. Could there be a truce before? Yes, that too. So is there a rift? Yes, there is a very big rift today. Can this rift be repaired? Maybe if Trump changes his mind. But what we do see is that anything can be expected. Yes. And yes, the transatlantic relation has been severely undermined and weakened. And that is a fact, and that will never change because we just don't know who to trust at this point.
Erol, let me just read you something that Ukraine's President Zelensky said. Some in Europe may not fully understand what's happening in Washington right now. Does America need Europe as a market? Yes. But as an ally, I don't know. For the answer to be yes, Europe needs a single voice, not a dozen different ones. How can Europe present a more united front?
So if Europe wants to, coalesce and get behind this new world order where we have a multipolar world order, as Marco Rubio has come out and said. I mean, this is a big deal. He said the U.S. is not the indispensable nation. We're not looking for a bunch of multilateral agreements. We're looking for bilateral agreements that benefit the American businessmen and the American interests first. And I think once Europe embraces Europe first mentality and negotiates with America from that sort of perspective, then I see no reason why we can't rebuild the partnerships we have. Real friends have disagreements. Real friends hash it out in public like this. And the fact that it is happening exactly on the timeline of how most centuries go. Most centuries don't start on the zeros. Most centuries start around the 20s after certain people cycle out. If you look at each historical change, especially in European power, if you want to go look at the end of the concert of Europe or things like that. So you're in a rebuilding phase. Right now, Europe has kind of, destroyed its own industry. It's gone far on the green scale, but it's left behind a lot of its citizens. When you look at its economics, you don't have European companies that are competitive on the global scale. Apple Computers is worth the entire British stock market combined. So it becomes a financial issue. Can Europe still pull its weight? Europe was so focused on giving away all of its privilege and whatnot that it ended up with very little chips at the end. And its neighbor, Russia, has very many chips. And it's a willingness to use bodies that Europe is not willing to use in a battlefield. So we need to bring the US and Europe back to the discussion table, but Europe needs to figure it out first. And by Europe, I mean all the countries of Europe. Yes, the EU, but also the Baltic states and also border states like Finland and Sweden, who are much more perilously impacted. I think all of that together is the message we're going to have for a new 21st century American-led world security alliance.
Well, Denis, Erol thinks that Europe needs to sort itself out. But, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission chief, said a strong Europe was also good for the US. So what should Brussels do next, do you think? I mean, is it more important to work on consolidating EU ties, to look east, to rebuild with the United States, or a bit of all of those things?
It is absolutely true that Europe is disunited. It talks a big European Union game, but as I say, it doesn't have common policies on almost anything, whether it's China, whether it's the United States, whether it is trade, whether it's human rights, whether it's rule of law. Now that is a problem. So we are 27 sovereign national states. And to talk about Europe, I think, it's been exposed in this, is wrong. Mrs. Merkel, for example, Angela Merkel, the most powerful leader of Europe until she retired 4 or 5 years ago, was permanently on her knees in front of Vladimir Putin. She didn't challenge him on anything he was doing in the Crimea, in the Balkans, in the Caucasus. All she was interested in was flogging Mercedes and German cars and buying cheap Russian gas instead of rebuilding Europe's energy policy. I'm sorry you don't like green policy, Erol. You're speaking from California. I thought a guy who's based in California would be a bit sensitive about global warming after recent events. But Mrs. Merkel, no, she just didn't. She rejected nuclear policy. She rejected partnership with other European countries. She sabotaged a defense industry alliance with France and Britain. And that is Germany's problem. It doesn't know how to handle Russia. So I'm afraid, I'm speaking now as a profoundly pro-European person, but I'm not going to tell lies and clap my hands and say, this wonderful EU, isn't it great? It is not good enough. It's certainly been exposed in the recent crisis, but it won't be helped, I put it to you again, Erol, by this President of the United States, and I'm sure he'll change his mind, thinking that Neville Chamberlain is the model he should follow vis-a-vis an aggressive, tyrannical non-democracy that's invaded a sovereign state of Europe.
Why? Let's talk about where Europe might look, maybe alternative potential for influence. China's Wang Yi has been far more conciliatory towards the EU, talking about the bloc as partners, not rivals, on his latest diplomatic tour. In this 50th anniversary year of diplomatic ties between China and Europe, how do you see the relationship deepening? I mean, do you think we can expect Europe to pivot east, to maybe balance this shift away from the US?
Well, I guess, again, I would have to agree with Denis. It's very hard to say Europe. We have the EU, but we also have a lot of internal division that I think Trump is actually exacerbating. Divide and conquer, I would say. And so we don't have a common approach to China. We have some countries that are trying to bilaterally court China for advantageous trade deals, including Spain and Germany, for instance, who recently sent delegations there and hoping to get favorable treatment. But obviously this was looked down upon by the Commission, because in terms of trade, we're supposed to act as one. And what we're seeing is that we don't have a common voice on almost anything, as Denis was saying. We don't have a common voice on security. We don't have a common voice on trade. We've tried to, but when push comes to shove, every country wants to protect their interests. So I guess in terms of China, we have to walk a very fine line as well, because it will also depend on what America does with China. So so the EU is sort of stuck in the middle. Do we want to? We don't want a trade war with the US. We do want to get along with China, but what happens between the US and China will also affect us, because if, for instance, the US puts very high tariffs on Chinese goods, and this ends up in swamping the EU with affordable Chinese goods, this would be very bad for our markets as well. So we need to find a way to walk this tightrope between the US, because we don't want to antagonize them completely. They're our largest trading partner. And obviously China, very, very, very important trading partner. But whatever we do, if we get closer to China, we might get sanctioned by the US and vice versa. So very, very hard to do. And if we add to that the fact that we don't have a common voice, that we're so internally divided, it's very hard for me to even posit on what is going to happen in terms of the EU towards their trading partners. And the same goes for security, sadly. And I wish we could have a common voice, but as the summit on Monday showed, we were expecting some type of announcement after the summit with Macron and the hastily convened security summit. Nothing came out. No agreement on whether or not to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. France and the UK seem to like the idea. Poland, no. Germany, no. So. And I think this can be extended to almost every policy. We don't have a common voice, so it's going to be very, very, very difficult to move forward. The one thing I think everyone does agree on, at least in terms of security, is that we need to spend more.
Erol, you said, look, good friends argue about stuff, and then they argue about it publicly so that they can get to a new place. Is that what is going on here, or are we seeing a major shift in global power structures?
It's a bit of both. There is a shift. I mean, there's a shift in terms of the U.S.'s willingness to be an open bank. For example, Americans don't have free health care and don't have free education while they pay for the defense of Europe, and they see that Europeans do. That's a domestic issue that now Americans have brought to the table. When you look at tariffs and stuff, I would tell everybody to look at the internal tariffs between European nations. It's easier to trade between American states than European nations. And when you look at the trade imbalance, I mean, we have an incredible trade deficit for goods specifically coming into the U.S. Now, we have a surplus on services, but if you were to say tax our services, well, that affects a bunch of rich guys in Silicon Valley. That doesn't involve the manufacturing sector, and that's not going to be a trade war that Europe can win. So there is no need for a trade war. Trump is coming in with these tariffs as a cudgel to try to force European behaviors. Now, there are some disagreements he has, whether it be that we can't export cars to Germany. Maybe it's because their cars are better than ours. I can't speak on that directly, but the point is there is an imbalance, and that's where it's happening. I don't think this is the end of the Western alliance. I think it's a reforming, and I think that the sort of, in our perspective, keep in mind, the far left, wind energy, Greta Thunberg wing of how Europe went is not the way that America wants to see things go. And while that's perhaps an oversimplification, keep in mind, we elected people who are there for the regular Americans. Our presidential candidate and our vice presidential candidate, for the first time, are representing, as a Republican, the majority consensus. These are everymen, and these are people who are not concerned about foreign entanglements. That was Thomas Jefferson or George Washington's dying wish, never to get involved in foreign entanglements. And I think isolation is not the goal, but nationalism does not mean isolationism. It's not America first and alone. It's America first and everybody first, and we can all work together to build a more verdant future.
Erol, Morkoc, Denis, Macshane, Waya, Quiviger, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, Germany decides, what will the election result mean for Europe's economic future? But for now, from me, Juliet, Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.